Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, good evening and welcome to the Visual Voices lecture hosted by the School of Art at George Mason University. My name is Jeffrey Kenny. I'm an associate curator with Mason Exhibitions. And as always, I would like to start tonight by acknowledging the Monacan Nation, including the Manahoe people, the traditional owners of the land and waters upon which George Mason University stands. In addition, on behalf of the Mason School of Art community, I just want to affirm our commitment to anti-racism, social justice, and creating a culture of excellence, inclusion, and accessibility. We will have a Q&A session following tonight's lecture, so we ask that you save your questions until the end. If you would like to ask a question at that point, you'll be able to do so by using the raise your hand feature, which can be found at the bottom of your Zoom screen under the reactions folder. Once called upon, you may then unmute yourself and ask your question directly to the artist. Tonight's lecture will be recorded. It will be made available for view on our websites roughly 1 week from today. And that's on the Mason Exhibitions website as well as the School of Art website. And if you're in the class, that'll be on Blackboard. During the presentation, you may keep your video on, but please mute your microphones when you enter. So tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Amanda Ross-Ho. Amanda Ross-Ho is an interdisciplinary artist and professor of sculpture at the University of California, Irvine. Amanda Ross-Ho's work takes the form of sculptural installations and material environments that propose dynamic and imagined ecologies of labor, time, and the building of speculative archives. Through close observation, she identifies and brings into form connective tissues between personal and eternal conditions. She holds a BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and an MFA from the University of Southern California. She has exhibited, lectured, and taught widely, nationally and internationally, including the 2008 Whitney Biennial, the Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, the Walker Art Center, the Bonner Kunstverein, and the Vleeshal Contemporary Art Center. Recently, she was included in Crack Up, Crack Down, the 33rd, I can't pronounce this word, but Vleeshal Biennial of Graphic Arts, curated by Slavs and Tatars, and presented a solo exhibition at the Kunsthall Stavanger, Norway. She has presented commissioned public works at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, City Hall Park, New York City, the Parcours Sector of Art Basel, Switzerland, and the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. Her work has been featured in Art Forum, the New York Times, Art Review, Modern Painters, Art in America, Flash Art, Art in Auction, and Freeze, among others. Ross-Ho lives and works in Los Angeles. Thank you for making time for us, Amanda.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. And I want to thank Jeffrey and Loza for your time and your help bringing me here. It's a treat to be with you all. I know we are in virtual format still, but it's a pleasure to be tuning in from Los Angeles, specifically Tongville Dance. I'll make my own land acknowledgement here. And I am really happy to be with you all, and I'm going to share a ton of images. I will move a little bit quickly, so bear with me. And I'm really pleased to share some work with you today. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully this works. All right, can everybody see that okay? All right, very good. Thumbs up, excellent, fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Again, I really appreciate the generous invitation to be here. And whenever I start to talk about the work, I always think of different ways to sort of introduce myself, because it's its own tricky kind of question. So today I thought I would kind of start by showing you some personal images and call out some of my early influences to sort of track some of the origins of my sensibility, and to talk about some of my sort of early childhood experiences, just for a moment, just to give you a little bit of foundation. And then after that, I'm going to show sort of a taxonomical view of a bunch of projects over a bunch of years, and kind of highlight or try to highlight some of my main working practices that I've kind of used over the years, and highlight a few key projects. I'll zoom through some, and then some I'll go a little bit deeper. So that's sort of the plan. Okay, so I'm going to start with this odd pairing of images. You might be asking, what are these images? Which I think kind of define the arena for my artistic activity. It was fun for me to dig these up, reaching back into my past. So as Jeffrey mentioned, I was born and raised in Chicago, and trained as a professional ice skater for a bunch of years of my life. Competitive, I should say, competitive more than professional. And this training was very specifically a combination of skating compulsory figures that you might be familiar with, and athletics, but also choreography and stagecraft. And specifically theatrical performances using props and costumes and things like this. Also, my mom was an artist, but she also worked as an ecologist, and regularly exposed me to her study and her kind of intellectual curiosity into flora and fauna. And so what you're seeing on the left here is actually me dressed as in the role of the Rat King in a production of The Nutcracker on Ice. And then on the right, I'm attempting home taxidermy, and I'm stuffing a bird that my cat killed and left on our doorstep. One important detail is the costume on the left is missing the sort of paper mache and faux fur rat headpiece, but you can kind of get the idea that this kind of distinction between the theatrical and the empirical is what I want to kind of talk about today with my work. And I feel like these sort of sum up these major components of my sensibility. So theater, athletics, anatomy, and forensics. And you're going to hear me say these terms kind of over and over throughout the course of the talk today, because these are sort of ways in which I, see in my work. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more and kind of get into it. So again, these early experiences of performance and theater and athletics really established this interest between the sort of overlap between, the analytic and empirical, in terms of the science of this sort of taxidermic kind of exercise. And then things like scale and exaggeration. And to this day, I use those in my work, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Another really important influence for me is that even though I primarily work in sculpture and object making, my work is completely rooted in image making. I was raised by parents who were artists and photographers, and who prioritize looking at the world in this very exhaustive manner. For them, everything was a pictorial subject, and they really instilled that in me, and really taught me to kind of train my gaze and recognize a potent image, and also to sort of act on that recognition or act on that impulse and reflex to capture moments that were kind of on the precipice of loss. And you'll hear this again and again as I kind of go through the work. This kind of instilled for me, in me, this rather pathological kind of impulse to archive, right? This archival impulse, and define the world as this, and all of its contents as this infinite unfolding series of near losses in need of rescue. So I kind of have this gaze as I move through the world. So on the left is an image of my mom and I in our family darkroom as a kid. And on the right is one of my first photographs that I made when I was 4 years old. And I shot that with a medium format camera. I think the look on my parents' face, frankly, is worried that I'm gonna drop this really expensive piece of equipment. But anyway, this photographic impulse is really important in my work, and I'm gonna talk about that more. Okay, so I consistently make work in a few major modalities, and I was kind of thinking about how I could talk about the work today, and I realized that, what would be interesting is to kind of classify things into some major kind of arenas, right? Some major components of how I work. I'm sorry. Let me just go back because I think that is interrupting my screen a little bit. So one modality that I work in is the building of monuments to specific artifacts through a kind of forensic recreation. So in these pieces, I'm kind of anatomically disarticulating objects and recreating them at large scale. And this is something I do very often in the work. These are in part materially influenced by professional experiences and skill sets that I have, some of which are based in working as a textile designer for a period of time, and then also as a prop maker for the movie industry, which informed my production techniques and also introduced me to a bunch of specialists, so prop makers and special effects people that work in the movie industry that I've collaborated with for a long time. And I'm just gonna go through a few of these pieces. You can get a sense of the scale here. These gloves are about 7 feet tall. So I've come to realize that these works actually stem from a form of grief and kind of unrealistic compassion for things, right? And in reaction to loss. And I developed these very tender attachments to idiosyncratic artifacts that kind of end up populating the chance or commonplace encounters of everyday life. And through the work, I kind of promote them to this outsized or kind of eternal status. And that's something I talked about a little bit in the statement. This is a large scale earring piece, human scale there for you. And so for me, the use of scale shifting is really not intended to create a shifted power relationship, but more so to bring the viewer into a position of, closer intimacy with form, and also to invite or agitate this close attention. I'm really aiming for a kind of extreme intimacy with these pieces. So as their kind of scale is an embodied encounter with a viewer, I'm really sort of aiming for this idea of being close. Just a few more pieces of that kind of body of work. And these works are really connected to image production, right? So not in the sense of just subjecting forms to scaling, although that's a big part of it for me. It's like almost like, blowing up a photograph, but also objectifying through a sort of self-conscious frontality. And so you can kind of tell the way I'm presenting these pieces is, very much about, they sort of function more like close-up photographs or continuity photographs, or maybe even forensic images. And I'm really interested in the idea of them not containing containing very little outward editorial position. It's a detail. And so at the end of the day with these pieces, it's like the idea is that the chronic use of scale and replication is really about this fraught relationship with loss. And it's interesting because it's taken me a while to come around to that language, but I do think that's sort of what's at the root of many of these pieces. The idea of realizing something transient or kind of ephemeral or impermanent at large scale does this thing which kind of memorializes and also describes the magnitude of grief, right? Through an embodiment, through a physical embodiment, but also multiplies it and doubles the burden. So it's a little bit of a tricky, slippery slope. Some details here. And so in making these pieces, I developed these very intense communions with forms, right? So this is a piece that's actually made based on a found backpack. It's a backpack that I found on the back of a dumpster in Chicago, in my hometown. And I recreated it through a lot of different prop making tricks. But I think of these pieces as these grandiose gestures to kind of like in devotion to these kind of likely bonds that I make with these objects, right? This kind of idiosyncratic random thing that I found at the side of the road, kind of going through this elaborate kind of recreation process is sort of this form of perverse empathy is what I sort of think about it. It's a way of resisting the normative boundaries of something and promoting this unreasonable kind of behavior based kind of in the name of true connection. So this is how I think about these monument pieces. There's a human scale reference there for you. Few details. I won't talk about the production of this, but there's a lot of tricks of mold making and other object making and some photographic elements. You can ask questions later if you want. I realize that this is actually kind of creating a screen issue, so I'm trying to make a better presentation here. Hold on one second so you don't have to look at that Zoom window for some reason. Okay, so earlier I showed you the image on the left of my mom and I in our family darkroom. And the piece on the right is a work called Omega, which I actually made in 2012. This is a large scale fabricated sculpture, which is of the Omega D2 enlarger that's actually in the image on the left side. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit because this is a little bit more in detail, because this is kind of, to my mind, is a sort of apex scaled object. So I produced this sculpture for the survey exhibition of my work. And by this time I'd been, by this time I'd been making scaled objects for a bunch of years. And so for me, creating this monument to this object was this very intimate way for me to memorialize both the formative origins of my creativity, which I mentioned through my family and through picture making, but also the personal muscle memory that I had kind of embedded in this thing. So when I was a child, you know, I knew how to make pictures before I even understood what art was. And this object was like kind of this very, very personal artifact or kind of utility in our home. It's almost like you have like a stove and a fridge and an enlarger. It was kind of like, you know, basically the same thing to me. And I know this form and all of its contours totally anatomically, right? Like I know every inch of it. I remember what it feels like to turn the knobs and, you know, had this very close relationship. And I also was interested in this idea that it poked fun a bit at my own use of scaling, right? It served as a kind of centerpiece of this installation, and also suggested that kind of everything around it had been subject to manipulation and maybe synthesis. But I was thinking about it again as this like the ultimate scaled object. So I'm just going to show you a little bit, some details of the piece. And so this work was also kind of a visual pun, right? An enlarged and larger, again, being like the ultimate scaled object. And I was also interested in the naming convention of the word Omega. So you can see at the top of this image, there's a label from the actual piece. So the company name, Omega, the brand name, you know, is recreated here, but taken separately from that, the word itself was also interesting to me, which signaled, the word Omega kind of signals like an end, a closure. And for me, this had something to do with mortality. So to make this sculpture, I worked with a Hollywood prop fabricator named Lawrence Pullman, who's a friend and also became one of my chief collaborators for many years. And I became very interested in prop making as a method for sculpture production because it is a practice of making objects that are sensitive to the lens, right? They're meant to be filmed. They're meant to be seen through a moving image camera or a still camera. And so they're very aware of the gaze of the lens. And I became very interested in this. So prop making also proposes a different relationship between objects and time. And I'm going to talk about time a bunch in a minute, so bear with me. But to make this sculpture, we disassembled the original object, the enlarger object, to its countless parts and refabricated each piece through various techniques, which of course is this slowing down of the object. And that's something I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a minute as well. Some details of this. And so with this piece, I was really interested in creating this uncanny kind of high resolution object, right? That would recursively function like a photograph. So it was a little bit, you know, also kind of reaching into, you know, the function of this thing and turning that around. There were many details on this piece, like the carefully recreated wear and tear, that's simulated rust, for example, and also these sort of really subtle kind of indications of touch and traces, including a row of cigarette burns along the bottom edge of the wooden base of the enlarger, where my parents would actually rest their lit cigarette while working in the darkroom. It was the 60s, what do you want? So just a few more details of this piece, just to kind of give you a sense of the physicality. You might be wondering how big that is. I'm going to help you out here with this image, which is a scale image of my sneaker. You can kind of get a sense of the scale of that plug. The piece is 13 feet tall. It's a giant behemoth. Okay, I'm going to move forward a little bit and kind of talk about another modality that I work in, which is installation. So for me, I think of this mode as working as sort of a choreography or even a writing practice. These are kind of tableaus or imagined ecologies. Ecologies meaning a grouping of elements and forms that kind of work together to kind of create a totality, right? I'm very much thinking about the fragment and how things link together and how they kind of combine and talk to each other. So ecology in that sense. And they're made from found and made objects and images, sometimes architectural interventions in some of the earlier pieces, and And often some of the upscaled objects I just described are woven into these tableaus alongside rational forms, so things that are like the same scale as your body, or the in scale, rational scale with your body, to create these kind of destabilizing scale relationships in a space. So I'm going to show you just a few of these pieces and kind of go through them. I'm not going to talk about them individually because there's not a lot of time, but just give you a sense of like the idea of working in spaces, right, in rooms, and kind of building these kind of combinations of things together that kind of talk to one another. These pieces are constellational, and they're also linguistic. So for me, again, they feel related to language. The families of forms and images are intended to be read together. And so I think about them as relational in that way. And for me, these works are also a way to orchestrate these kind of para-narratives. So sort of alongside kind of a rational narrative, right? Something sort of cryptic and a bit kind of fragmented. And doing this through space, through spatial engagement, kind of the interaction of forms, the proximity of forms, how they kind of rub against each other and create friction. And this is what I mean by speculative archive. An archive typically of sort of a grouping of things that maybe have a relational sense to one another. For me, I'm interested in making these groups that maybe appear unrelated, right? A group of things that maybe don't at first glance seem as though they have anything to do with one another, perhaps a totally random smattering of things, but drawing those connections together for you to sort of build these cognitive links. So in that way, they're speculative, they're invented, they're kind of proposing other ways in which we can kind of find connection between things. You can see I use a lot of mediums. I'm using sculpture, I'm using painting, photography, many different also literal mediums as well. And I'm kind of cruising through these fast just to give you a texture, you guys, so bear with me. I'll talk about some things more specifically in just a second. So with the installation work, again, these are often fragmented, and the conditions that that fragmentation sets up are intended to, again, suggest these kind of complex connective tissues between things. If you think about connective tissue in the body, you'll notice I use a lot of anatomical kind of language because I really like end up referring to this anatomical structure as a way to sort of understand our movement, our own corporeal bodily movement through space, but also just the way things kind of interact, thinking about that as an anatomical kind of proposal. And these are also, by the way, completely not chronological. They're zooming all over the place time-wise. We're on a time machine. But also the installation work, and I'm spending a great deal of time on this because it is kind of the bulk of the work, I'd say. The installations for me, you know, while they intend to sort of initiate these cognitive impulses to understand and to read, I specifically author into them a resistance to that coherence. And that's something that I'm interested in intentionally doing with the work. And there's probably some recognizable forms here. This is based on a dark room. So again, those are based on face masks. And so I see these works again as having this strong relationship to writing. You know, in some ways, I guess you could compare this to like a poetry practice or maybe speculative fiction, meaning invented kind of narratives in the sense that they bring together unlikely or concrete kind of combinations of forms, but also kind of edge into like a non-linear storytelling. So things are happening, but there's not really the ability to kind of tell a very linear, clear story. And that's really important to me. Okay, so another impulse and kind of a modality of mine is to make these deep dive kind of investigations into existing archives, existing databases of not just imagery, but also cultural forms. These are really intimate negotiations with, again, the anatomy of these forms that gain logic through repetition. And so this kind of like serial production. So when I make these pieces, I usually will make them in large numbers, in kind of as this way of like reiterating and reiterating. This is one example, which is a series of cut canvas pieces made from found photographs. And these are all generated from handmade doilies. And then later in this series, I started to make images of macrame wall hangings or pieces from macrame wall hangings. I started these in the early 2000s. I'll just show you a couple. So these are made of paint and canvas, and they're made literally by reiterating the form's contour and silhouette repeatedly. So first it comes straight out of an image, which I scan, and then I digitally manipulate it, and then it is projected. I draw them, I paint them, and then I cut them. So I reiterate the form and the actual physical structure of the object many, many times, and become completely familiar with it. It's like almost like a form of meditation slash memorization. And so just to be clear, what you're looking at is the black portion is paint. The white portion is actually the wall. So all of that is free hanging, and it holds together by virtue of the paint soaking into the canvas. So it's like a physical object. And I'm interested in a bunch of things with these pieces, just as an example of the sort of serial kind of way that I work with these things. So with these, I'm interested in pulling an image, right, of a handmade thing. So the doilies and the macrames, these are craft objects that are like somebody physically made these with their hands laboriously and with great time investment, right? And then pulling that through like a series of translations, again, renegotiating the interior and the contour many, many times in order to ultimately resuscitate it to a handmade object. It's kind of like pulling something through a picture. And I got very into this idea of translating and sort of seeing what I could access through the photograph itself. They're incredibly laborious, and you can tell labor is a huge kind of key component in my work. And the laborious process in these pieces is really meant to mimic the process that kind of goes into these original pieces, right? These original craft objects. And another way to kind of literally connect the structure of the depiction with that of the translation. So I'm interested in that negotiation. Very different kind of archive or database, but this is another one that I've explored a little bit more recently. This is from the last couple of years, and just a little bit of a backstory. I'm a caretaker for numerous family members, so I spend a lot of time in medical environments. Some of you may also. And so this next work came out of regular, encounters in these health environments. And this is a pain measurement scale. It's also known as a universal pain assessment scale, or a pain assessment tool, comparative pain scale chart. It has a million names. And it's a tool that was originally devised by a pair of pediatric nurses in the early 80s the idea being to come up with a effective way for patients with limited verbal communication to communicate the sensation of pain. So pre-verbal, language barriers, whatever the sort of variety of communication issues, this is this idea to make a metric that would measure pain. What they arrived at was this ideogram, which is faces. So starting from 0 with no hurt, going all the way to 10, hurts worse, right? And this, and oftentimes they would be accompanied like this with different text kind of explanations. And of course, there's a jillion different versions of this. And as I started to research them, I realized how many there were that would start to kind of like tell a little bit of a story in terms of what their use was, or perhaps, their particular, cultural identification, different languages, different visual kind of forms. Anyway, but again, this idea that this scale would be this universal metric for the abstract sensation of pain was super interesting to me. So I actually made a series, this is an ongoing series, but I researched, again, a bunch of different versions of this scale, and I recreated all of the extreme end. So the number 10s, right, the Hertz worsts of these different pain scales. And I produced them by hand as these large scale kind of quilted textiles. They're sewn with an industrial sewing machine, and they have this sort of very frenetic, anxious kind of feeling. And the idea for me here was a bunch of different things, but one, just physically to kind of give this graphic, right? This very flat, kind of cold graphic, this very tactile, kind of anxious physical form, right? So it's like making this graphic thing that's supposed to be generic and kind of flat into this really physical thing. And of course, embedding my own anxiety into them. So this series was called Untitled Crisis Actor, or is called, because I'm still making them, which is, I use that title for a couple of different reasons. You can tell I use language and care about language, but I wanted to indicate the combination of artifice and intense, authentic sensation. But it also, Untitled Crisis Actor, also draws some reference to some of the far-right conspiratorial rhetoric that was kind of circulating around this time at the beginning of the Trump administration, kind of thinking about that rhetoric and that language. And so that flipping of it, right, the intense authenticity and the sort of, burgeoning of like fake news and all of this, right? And so the impossibility of measuring abstraction was also another thing that interested me, in addition to this intersection of this incredibly personal sensation and this very generic placeholder. It's almost about the failure of this thing, right? The failure of this chart. But I'm also interested in the slippery subject-object positionality of these pieces, if that makes sense. So in other words, while they depict a facial space of expression, right? Supposedly the subjectivity of the face itself, they're, in its own interiority, they're also intended to reflect the subject of the viewer, the person looking at it. So they're kind of like prefabricated mirrors. It's a interesting slippery looping kind of mechanism. So you can tell I really like loops is another thing. So I'll just show you one more of these a little bit more close up, because the rest of those are like install shots. You can also see that the installation was kind of meant to feel like the chart itself. I was also thinking about it as a chorus of like grief. You can see the way the sewing is made here is intentionally meant to be rough and kind of, anxiety filled. I wanted it to feel like it was like falling apart. Okay, very different work. And again, back to my sort of modalities, right? This is my organizing principle of the talk today. So I also make work in the public sphere, and I'm only going to talk about one piece today, but I just wanted to kind of, address the, working in public space. So, these are works, and I made a few that engage, communal space, monumentality, accessible viewership, and also the idea of exporting ideas of scale into places where scale is expected, architectural spaces, but also without the sort of rarefied interior space of a gallery or a museum or the interior. So I'm just going to talk about this piece, which is a work I made on the plaza at the MCA Chicago in 2013. And it's called The Character and Shape of Illuminated Things. And it's based on this amateur photo manual from 1980 called How to Control and Use Photographic Lighting. The author here, David Brooks, produced this chapter in the book, which is the namesake for the piece. That was called The Character and Shape of Illuminated Things. And what he did to make this piece was he took a cube, a mannequin head, and a sphere, and then he changed the studio lighting many, many times to basically demonstrate how the character of these objects would shift based on the lighting. So it was a really specific kind of, technical exercise. But I became totally fascinated with these images, and it took me a while to figure out why. And I think it was dovetailing with the sort of proposal of making a public project. And one of the things that was kind of troubling me was this idea of what to monumentalize, how to kind of think about that space of elevation. And I became taken with these images as a way to think about these objects as placeholders for content. In other words, I was interested in the idea that these were blanks. They're non-specific. They have some references like the human form and planar surfaces and curves and things like this to demonstrate the sort of technical part of lighting. But what I liked about it is that it's they're placeholders for content, right? Placeholders for our gaze. And so as a public project, I thought I became really interested in this idea of elevating that into a monument, so that it's basically a monument to your gaze, right? I'm really interested always in this idea of comparing our own kind of apparatus of looking with a camera, again, based on my personal experience, but also just as a way of really kind of thinking about that as something that, can be manipulated and controlled and kind of looked at in and of itself. I was also interested in this object, which is called, geez, I just lost the name of it all of a sudden, but it's basically for color correction card, which is placed in photographs to do post-production on images. So typically you don't see these images. So this image that you're seeing now is something you would use to do, color correction on the image, and then you would throw it out. It's like a working image. It's an inadvertent collage that comes from using this tool. And so I put that into the public project because I wanted the piece to have and really outward and self-consciousness as photographic subject, right? So when you're looking at it as a viewer, you're aware, and almost like the objects are aware of your gaze, that they're meant to be photographed, they're meant to be kind of seen. And so kind of drawing a connection between your gaze and the camera. The other thing I really liked about translating this to a public project is that the sunlight kind of performed this idea of the light as it moved through those original images changing every time it would kind of shift. If anyone's from Chicago or knows, the weather changes every 5 minutes. So it was also like a personal joke for my city, which is my hometown. But you can tell even just between those two images, as the sun would shift throughout the day, it would change the visual kind of effect of the pieces. And so I was interested in that kind of, performing of the original photos. The other thing I was well aware of was that the work was going to be digested through social media and through cameras. It's just a fact of life in terms of how we look at things. And so we anticipated this and kind of allowed that to happen, to build an archive of images so that the work in social media and otherwise would kind of go back to images. And I liked that kind of looping quality. So again, this idea of like building equations of in the artwork that loop back on each other or somehow become, explicitly recursive of one another is something that's really interesting. Right after making that piece, I became interested in the digital kind of consumption of the first sculpture, and I got invited to do another public sculpture. So just to quickly show you an iteration of that first piece, this is in New York at the City Hall Park in the Public Art Fund project called Image Objects, in which I rendered the same objects at smaller scale. This time, instead of using the color card, which is kind of an analog photo device, rendering that facial recognition box, which is of course from your smartphone and wildly familiar at this point, in neon. So when you photograph the piece like this person is here, you would kind of get this doubling where the facial recognition box would pop up in your phone as you were kind of documenting. So I was kind of like thinking about that as like this weird way of kind of like sneaking into your phone in this kind of interesting way. Okay, changing course again. So one other modality that I work in is performance and engagement and what I think of as like activity-based choreography, in which I am kind of working on site and entering into these labor and time-based relationships with intimacy and kind of getting into a form and process in the actual place where it's going to be seen specifically. So again, this involves making work on site in like sustained engagements with the physical space, sometimes for long periods of time. So this is the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in 2010. This was a show called Wallworks, where a series of artists were asked to come in and make things directly on site. So I was perfectly suited for that, having already been interested in such a thing. And I worked with a team of volunteers, and we painted these structures directly on a canvas, on these canvas panels on the wall, so that it would bleed through onto the wall. And then we cut all of the painted material back out. And so what the public was able to see was basically this, very large kind of presentation of vacancy, of negative space. And that's something that this like backwards working, undoing, the undoing being the sort of presentation was something I was interested in there. But specifically, this was about a month's worth of work of, working on site day in and day out. And so these kinds of like, contracts with, making things elaborately in real time outside the space of the studio or outside the space of like a place designated for production, right, is interesting to me. This is another piece along those same lines. This is a piece called Untitled Nothing Factory, which I did at the Visual Arts Center at the University of Texas in Austin. And this was a immersive kind of performative installation that also lasted about a month long, in which I opened up the gallery, typically would be closed during install for a month or whatever it is. And students and the general public were able to come in, and I set up a production environment in the space. And what we had 3 different stations. People were making blank canvases, empty vessels, ceramic vessels, and then blank sheets of paper that we were making from recycling all the paperwork from the administrative offices of the school. And so the idea was to build this kind of, hyper productive environment towards building these blanks, right? It'd be a monument to nothing, or a monument to a potential, monument to something, forthcoming. So obviously the blank canvas suggesting kind of, a mark, and the paper, suggesting, language or whatever it is, and the vessel. So these different versions of sort of empty space. So here I am making paper with some of the students. And hanging 350 canvases on the museum walls. And then we crystallized the installation and existed this way for a period of time too, which was also interesting, right? Like you were able to step outside the sort of activity period and experience it as kind of a static installation. Okay, so I want to talk about more of these sort of immersive projects, sort of performative, but I want to get into one a little bit more deeply and specifically. So I'm going to talk about two pieces in particular that are very recent to give you kind of in a little bit more detail, to kind of give you a sense of how I work and how I'm interested in kind of generating ideas. So these are two references which informed the next project. And for a long time, I've been interested in inversion and time. So inversion as a gesture, I've shown you a few projects that already, kind of, I think, enact this idea of an inversion. So flipping something inside out. And then also time as like a material specifically. And so on the left is a stock image of inverted pockets, which is kind of a widely understood symbol of bankruptcy, popularized during the Great Depression, but also used perpetuated forever in mass culture, cartoons, things like this. And then the inversion of the sagging pockets is also, obviously suggests like lack, right? Or emptiness, or maybe even impotence, right? Those sort of, and then on the right is this interesting thing that some of you may know called a barbershop clock, which is a clock, a functioning clock, which is designed with both the graphic, so the numbers, and the movement, meaning the actual clock mechanism backwards. So it can be viewed in a mirror when you're getting your haircut. It's the silliest, most like absurd object. And I became totally obsessed with this thing and specifically started thinking about the two in tandem, right? They're these two things that kind of describe measure through inversion, right? Like they're measuring things, but through this kind of flipping. So I developed a pattern for a pair of pants at large scale. You can see the sort of normal size pants on the right, the upscaled ones on the left, exaggerating the pockets and inverting them. And this is what the kind of, prototype pair of pants ended up looking like. And then I also created a video of this barbershop clock that I showed you a minute ago. And to make this, I shot a 12-hour real-time shot of the clock operating and sped it up to an hour. I think I could show a clip. Let me try to do that quick. Okay, that gives you enough of a sense of it. So basically a 12-hour continuous shot, which is harder than you think, actually. It's a huge file. It's the biggest file, 12-hour video, but sped up to an hour, which gives you that sense of urgency and anxiety. And these two kind of pieces became the sort of locus for this installation kind of performance that I made. So for a show at the Vleeshal Contemporary Arts Center in the Netherlands, I proposed to import this industrial sewing environment, so the equipment, the machines, and all the materials and everything on the patterns I kind of got set up in advance, and produce a set of these 12 of these large scale pants on site for a month. And the idea was to choreograph this elaborate high production assembly line that resulted in this symbol of amplified counterproductivity, right? Like it kind of negates itself. And I wanted to create this kind of, I don't know, tragicomic or slapstick kind of satire, basically, that would somehow and somewhat like theatricize both my own exploitation as an artist and, how I sort of interact with these capitalist systems that sort of demand this productivity. So for the duration of the month, I created these garments at very high pace within the museum, documenting, taking notes, and kind of saving all these production artifacts throughout the production period. And it was really kind of, at this time as an artist, you might be able to tell, I was becoming kind of suspicious of these models that equated value with high productivity. And I was kind of poking fun of that while also kind of like entering myself again into this system. So it's a bit of like a doubling of the burden, like I mentioned earlier. But you can see that I was taking notes and kind of like watching how the materials would kind of move around the space as I was producing them. And I did that for a very particular reason, not only because I was making the stuff, but I wanted to borrow some of those gestures for the final installation. And so this is what the piece looked like, when I installed it in the actual museum space, which is this remarkable late Gothic kind of building. But also, I utilized the idea of the table as a production space in the actual exhibition. So I made these 3 mirrored tables. You can see the pants are on either side. And then I have these 3 mirrored tables that contain the artifacts of producing the pants. And so I really want to do this thing where I collapsed the presentation and the production and kind of all of the sort of boundaries between those spaces, but also compared all those different kind of economies. And so again, the pants were displayed along with these mirrored tables, which all of the arrangements on the tabletops are these staged kind of arrangements of the residue of the making. So, and down at the end, you can kind of tell there is a large scale projection of the clock video I showed you, creating the sense of anxiety and urgency, and also reflecting back into the mirrored tables, the mirrors coming from that barbershop kind of functionality. So I'll just show you a few more images from that just to give you a sense of it. Obviously, the mirrors also reflect this like amazing architecture, and that really shifts based on, what the building is, kind of becomes a complexion of the space. I've traveled this show. So I traveled this show to 3 locations, and this was a second location at the Bonner Kunstverein in Bonn, Germany. A very different space, very German white cube. And also it had this very kind of like perfect architecture that was circular. It was a center space in the middle where we showed the video projection. And then I made an additional 12 pair of pants so that it kind of completed what I thought of as like something that represented the 24 hours. So there are 24 pairs with the addition of this red pair, which stood in for the second hand of the clock, which is hard to see in the video, but in the video, it's the only moment of color really in the entire exhibition. And so I called that out through this pair of red pants, which was kind of a fun addition. So each iteration that the show took, I would add some additional objects that had to do with making the exhibition in that room. And so it would kind of gain this logic over time. Here's a close-up of some of the tabletop details. So you can tell this is like almost like this very theatrical, almost retail space of these artifacts from the making of the pants. So pattern pieces, chalk, tailor's chalk from the sewing on the rolls of fabric, things like this. And then some idiosyncratic objects, like incorporated these tiny sneakers that were the exact match for my, the sneakers I was wearing that also appeared in the space, things like this. And then parts of pants that were kind of in progress. So I would arrest kind of these moments of the production and preserve them for this part of the install. So it was kind of like, making everything twice. The final location that I traveled this show to was the Tramway in Glasgow, which is very different exhibition space. I'm just going to show you one image because you've kind of gotten the sense of it now, but very different kind of chorus line presentation and a really different kind of sense of the continuity. So as I was kind of doing this project, one of the things I was interested in is recreating kind of forensically the installation exactly from place to place and kind of changing things. So that became interesting to me. Okay, rounding the bend, guys. So around the same time, I was spending a lot of time on eBay because it's one of the places where I kind of dig around and turn things up. And I collected these blank paper clock faces. So I was also, obviously already looking at the barbershop clocks. I was in the sort of clock section, if you will. And I found these blank paper clock faces. And so what these are is these are actually, paper faces that are screen printed, right on cardstock. And then you would slip them into a mechanism and you would add the hands and you would add the actual movement. And it's basically the raw materials of a clock. And I kind of became interested in these. Also, by the way, these are referred to as faces and hands. So the clock also has all these anatomical words, which are pretty fun. But these were, again, it's intended to be assembled, but as these kind of analog clocks were slipping into obsolescence, they were being sold bulk and kind of wholesale for very cheap as raw materials on eBay. So I was just intuitively attracted to them and I bought a bunch and I decided they were just this interesting surface to allow accumulations of my everyday life to just record upon. I'm a person who takes notes and scribbles, and there's constantly little sketches and things like that kind of coming out of my hands just all the time. And so it just needs a place to land. You know, sometimes it's on the back of receipts and envelopes and they go off into the ether. So this was this way of like locating it somewhere. You know, essentially just recording my life for a while. Sometimes I would come to the studio, but sometimes I'd just be at home like this, you know, accumulating like, you know, the residue of food and drinks and drawing scribbles and traces, right? So after a little while, I had a stack of about 100 of them, and I wasn't really certain how I would, you know, and if that was the end of the line, if they were just drawings, or if they were just therapy or whatever. And so, but I eventually, you know, after having this large archive of them, I decided to wrangle these into an exhibition. So here's just a few of those, what they look like, just the paper pieces themselves. So for a show that I did at my gallery in New York, Mitchell and Nash, I had these tables made. The table, you know, as a space of activity is very important in my work. It kind of comes in all the time. And I produced these large scale canvases in advance with the, you know, the clock face graphics. There are 5 different kinds, you know, screen printed right on the surfaces. And then I brought the paper pieces and a bunch of materials and basically lived in the gallery again for a month and developed this exhibition on site. So basically I chose 12 of the paper clock drawings. I was using 12 as this kind of way of referring back to the clock face. That's also how many pants there were in the other exhibition. I mean, this just became kind of a, these were made in close succession. So sort of the same family of thinking. You know, basically I chose 12 of them and throughout the month translated them faithfully onto the canvases by hand. And so for me, this was this act of forensics and prop making, right? More of this language, but also quantum acrobatics. I was really interested in this idea that I could take a year and kind of compress it into a month and kind of reiterate through this sustained kind of choreography, all of the chance marks, the notes, and the residue, kind of like stretching it out and compressing it at the same time. So it was like, yeah, this like, I think of it, yeah, it's like kind of using time as like a clay. I also incorporated found and made scaled artifacts into the installation to interact with the canvases, to kind of simulate the experience that the paper pieces had been through, you know, of all this action, but also to create a set of props that would be a sculptural tableau that would kind of accompany the paintings. So here's a base of an oversized wine glass, is like, you know, about 20 inches tall, 21 inches tall, and it's using I'm using it as a printmaking tool to form a ring of wine on the canvas. Here's another one. That's actual wine, by the way. So throughout the time, I trashed the place, basically. The tables accumulated all of the residue of production throughout the course of making these pieces. And to be clear, this was a kind of, you know, very athletic kind of, I really set myself up for, you know, a high production, and I was doing 14-hour days, ridiculous. And so I, you know, created this mess, basically an authentic mess in order to get it done. But I was also doing that to cultivate these sort of like relationships between the objects, much like the pants pieces, like watching how all that stuff would interact. And I was taking photos, continuity pictures, and documenting the whole time. So here's one of the pieces in progress. And you can see there's kind of these like irrational combinations of like a giant wine glass and a pen and a, you know, a real rag, and like letting some of the, you know, letting the paint kind of congeal on the surface. So at the end of the production period, I took everything off the tables and then reassembled it in this kind of like theatrical thing. So rather than it being this like authentic, you know, crime scene of what I had done in this space, I wanted there to be this kind of like fiction, a kind of like sense that you're walking into a totally authored or kind of mannered or preconceived space. And so I combined, you know, real artifacts and props, things that were, you know, rational scale and out of scale, both that I had made. So I actually brought some old artworks of mine back into the project in some cases. And then things from mass culture, like novelty objects, like those giant scissors that are used for, you know, ribbon cuttings and things like this, right? Brought those into the fold. And so I'll just show you a couple of details. There was this kind of confused provenance or origin, in other words, of the objects. Like, oh, well, where's this giant X-Acto blade? I actually made that, but then that giant pencil's, you know, purchased on eBay, right? There's actually websites that you can just buy giant things from, you know, at this point. And it's an interesting kind of another part of this project I won't really talk about too much right now is this idea of the novelty object, which is a thing in mass culture too, that I was also using as part of this project to poke fun at my own use of scale. And so giant quarters is about, the size of a, coaster, then a normal sort of rational scale fork, giant pencil, sort of all of this confused scale reference. I was kind of trying to create like a confusion or at least a complication to your experience moving through the space. Just a couple more images of that. And then I have just one more project I'd like to show you. Hopefully there's enough time. I know I'm pushing it, but tiny coffee cup and big quarter. Just a few more. This one actually had originated as a full ballpoint pen drawing, so that was a challenging but fun one to translate. Giant fork is about 4 feet long fork. And this one's great. I love this detail because it's hard to see, but here it says hyperbole epidemic, which is like exaggeration, which is so classic me. Something that I would write down and kind of talk about this idea of exaggeration. Okay, I have one more project and I'll go through it quickly because I know I want to leave time for your questions and your comments and have a conversation with you all. But the last thing I'm going to show you is very different. It's new and it's exciting. And I want to kind of tell you about it a little bit. And it kind of evades all the categories I just mentioned, or actually probably realistically, it collapses them all. So this is a virtual installation that I made recently for the online project Epoch, which is a really interesting project devised by the artist Peter Wu, who's based in LA. And Peter devised this digital project during quarantine, of course, and during this kind of widespread push towards people making virtual projects. But I feel like he did something really interesting with it. So he devised this project and it's very distinct. So I'll try to describe it. So what he does is he creates these elaborate 3D environments that are based on real locations, existing locations in the world, sometimes settings, sometimes buildings, sometimes landscapes. And he then, inside those spaces, curates thematic group exhibitions of artists who produce work specifically for the space. It's a really interesting premise. So artists can 3D scan physical objects if that's how they would prefer to participate, or they can create works within 3D. Sometimes there's videos, there's all different kinds of things. Of course, artists, come up with different ways to participate. So this project it was called Freeport, and the setting in the case of the one that I participated in is this place called the Luxembourg Freeport, which is exactly architecturally correct, but it's manipulated and aged into a ruin. So that's sort of his intervention. So just a little information about Freeports, just to give you some context for how I decided to participate. So if any of you are familiar with a Freeport, Freeports are unregulated kind of long-term storage facilities that physically store kind of high value assets and shelter them from taxable transactions, right? So they're in spaces that are kind of in between any jurisdiction of like a state tax or a particular country's tax. And so they basically create these shelters for things to remain untampered by tax transactions. You can tell that's obviously seems ripe for corruption, and it is. And so it's, they're very much known for being involved in this like corrupt trade activity. So for this project, Peter designed or recreated this Luxembourg Freeport, which is an existing place in the world, sits there now, and created a ruin, and then installed artwork inside, which is really, really interesting. And this is visible, you guys, so you can go to Epoch and you can take a look at this now. He archives all the projects, so you can see all the ones. This is, I think, the 6th one. He just opened a new one. So the idea of the Freeport was really interesting for me because it acts, especially for work that sits between the real and the virtual, right? So typically artworks sit in here for ages and physically kind of like are protected. And he kind of created with this virtual project, I feel like this kind of like virtual shelter for the works to sit in perpetuity, because it kind of, liberates artists from the burdens of the corporeal form, right? The physical thing, also the logistics, also the cost, also the shipping, the limitations of like being able to show in a space like this or to scale things to an unreasonable scale. And so it's interesting. They kind of, creates this alternative to these conventional presentation forms. Okay, I'll stop blabbing and I'll show you what I actually did. So rather than make physical forms and import them into 3D, I decided that I was interested in keeping my work that I made for the Freeport as like this activity within a closed system. And so I went and I found a 3D stock company that sells these stock 3D forms, and purchased 7 ready-made objects that were available for sale. And so these are usually designed and licensed for, video games or 3D design or whatever people use them for. And they're basically props, right? They're these kind of like inert objects or inert props awaiting activation. They're sort of floating, and they need to be merged with like a context and an environment. And so these are all found iterations of the search criteria mask. And I was interested in the idea of the mask within a virtual environment because it sort of has this like negating quality. The mask is like in a virtual space is like evacuated and multiplied, kind of doubling the artifice. So I was interested in this like kind of funny slipperiness. And I was interested in recontextualizing these kind of non-artisanal objects, right? These things that are completely stock and generic as these existing kind of instruments of currency that were like circulating between these 3D platforms. So that was kind of interesting. So these are the actual masks that I bought. And I was interested too in the fact that the interior negative spaces of each mask were actually rendered. And that just kind of put me in a tailspin. So I produced an exhibition where I installed these large scale in relational scale to the virtual environment, of course, face down, obscuring their kind of facial identities and presenting the interior cavities, which is something I'd probably do physically, but was able to do in sort of in these large scale warehouse spaces of the Freeport. So I'm just going to show you a few images from this because it was a really fun project. This one's Tragedy Mask. This one's like a carnival mask. And there's things that, obviously was able to do in virtual space that were impossible without great cost in the physical realm. For example, being able to work at the scale for them to float, for them to do these sort of supernatural kind of physical sculptural things. So for someone who makes sculpture, this is incredibly fun. Just a few more images of that, and then I'll wrap it up. There's also this way of using space that was like incredibly decadent. We were able to use these very kind of large, warehouse zones for these pieces, and imagine this really kind of like very different use of space that would be virtually impossible. And this is my favorite one, and also the last one I'm going to show. This is a sort of, very ubiquitous disguise, right? So they range from masks and disguises, of course. And the series was called Untitled Imposter. And each one would be sort of, again, toppled onto its face. So you sort of gaze into the cavity. And I thought of these as found 3D sculptures. So it was a really interesting project, and something that I think I'm now kind of building upon to kind of think about I don't know, to sort of imagine maybe some of these outcomes in real space. So it's an interesting way to kind of, again, loop around and consider, these sort of proposals of space that I probably would not have otherwise had I not done this project. So, okay, that is my last slide. You guys, I'm gonna, I guess, stop sharing if that's the right thing to do. I have no concept of time because we've kind of gone on a ride, but I'm gonna do that and open it up to you all for questions or comments or anything.
All right. Remember to raise your hand for questions. And you came in perfect time, Amanda. That was
good.
Right on.
I'm going to try to do gallery view because I don't know if I can see hands in the right order.
Well, while you do that, we're going to have John ask his question.
Okay, that sounds good.
What for your scaled objects like the light you showed us earlier based on your old photography room, what materials did you use? Looks so lifelike.
Oh yeah, probably like 100 different things. There were so many materials that went into that, but I can tell you a few specific ones that are kind of notable and interesting. So the enlarger piece is the one we're talking about. Yeah, so that piece, like I said, I worked with a prop maker, and for each kind of part that we took apart, we'd really, look at it and figure out, okay, can we use the material that the actual thing is made of, or can we simulate that somehow? It was really kind of this like question about, what would read best as a sculpture. The way we made our decisions was, we were aiming for something as illusory as possible. So as much of an illusion to like really feel real in that piece. You can tell some of the pieces I make sometimes have a little bit of, you can see the hand, you can see the stagecraft or kind of the edges of it. They're not perfect, but they're more interpretive. This one, we really wanted to be very, very close. So for example, I'll give you one example, the cord, that very large extension cord. It's not like you can go down to the hardware store and say, do you have a 500 scale, percent scale extension cord? It's like, it doesn't exist, right? It's like out of this world. So we ended up coming up with a way of getting a special die made. A die is basically like a stencil. And having a special piece of rubber extruded that was the shape of that cord. So that was like an extreme kind of situation. And then a lot of the things that you saw in the pictures, like the knobs, a lot of those were cast or carved out of foam, which sounds crazy, but then they were hard coated in like hard coat materials, so that they're very, very substantial. But if you took that knob off, because of course we had to take it apart to deinstall it or to pack it up or whatever. The inside of that is, this high density foam. So it's almost like an episode of the Twilight Zone. You take it apart and everything is like completely on one side, this kind of fiction. There were other things in that piece. There was aluminum. So the parts that were metal were mostly metal. The lens itself was a real trick because it's not a functioning object, but we really wanted it to look like, an optical apparatus. So we found this specialty piece of glass actually, which was very lucky. So yeah, tons of different materials. There's lots of casting. So some of the materials that like the other kinds of the smaller hardware, like the screws and things like that, we cast those out of plastic. And then they're painted, hand painted, and wood, and some things that play a role as themselves. Wood and metal mostly play themselves in the piece, but yeah, I could go on. It's like a list of 50 million things. So, but good question. Especially through pictures, it's like impossible to know because it's even hard to know in person. Jeff, what's the best way to do this? I feel like I want to honor people's order, but I don't know.
I don't. Yeah, you'll lose. I think Caitlin was next.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. Caitlin, happy to answer any question.
Hi.
Hi.
So it looks like you work in a lot of materials like sculpting, painting, and all that stuff. Which one's your favorite one to work with and why?
Good question. I'd like to say that I'm an omnivore. So as you kind of mentioned, I use a lot of different things, and I usually try to use whatever is going to be best to solve the problem, whatever it is, right? But you can tell probably also that I tend to lean very heavily on textiles. So I would say that is the medium that I end up probably using the most. And it's partially because I enjoy the way that I can intervene with it, the sort of the flexibility. I like the sort of ability to sort of, it doesn't have a sort of logistical problem. It's easy to store. It has a softness, but I also think there's conceptual things about it that I really love that have to do with time. Some of the things I mentioned that have to do with labor and kind of, flexibility that have to do with like intimacy and softness and the way that we, think of like our clothes or, the textiles in our home or things like this. So there's I really relate to that medium. And also in my BFA, when I studied at the Art Institute, we had a department there called Fiber and Material Studies, and I studied in that department. And so I'm sort of minted in a textile mode, even though I make all kinds of stuff. So yeah, I'd have to say that. Thanks. What about Christian? Oh, or whoever's next.
Yeah, Christian,
I can go. Sure. Thank you. I too am a sculptor and consider myself an omnivore when it comes to the arts and just love to learn every medium. The saying about It doesn't matter. But anyway, my question has to do actually with your process, I guess. It's about failure, right? So trying all these new mediums and doing stuff differently kind of each time that you do it. What part does failure play into, solving, you said solving that problem? When does that pop up, and how do you get past that and use it, I guess, as like a way to do better?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Let's see. I think it changes every time. One way to answer that would be because I think that everybody works in such different ways. One of the ways that I work is kind of, as I described, like trying these different ways of working, different metabolisms. So some things like the pieces that have a repetitive nature, I do that for a particular reason, because it allows me to sort of have this kind of meditative relationship with something that I sort of tease out slowly over time, or something that's performative, has that kind of, immediacy that calls upon other, skills, and calls upon different engagement with the viewer, all these different things. So for those, just in those two examples, the way failure sits in those two modes is very different, right? So if I'm making something that is, has a particular goal, there may be failure might be defined by, in the case of that, in larger piece, for example, going back to the story I just told, there was two different iterations of that extension cord before the one that worked, because it didn't quite have the gesture that we wanted, and we had to try again and try again. So in that case, failure was defined as like the lack of that illusion that we were going for. But in other cases, that is very speculative or very subjective, right? Like the idea of failure could be something that the criteria is kind of hard to define. So I think it really, for me, varies from kind of piece to piece based on what the plan is. I think there's always this element, I would say, in everything, in all of the different kind of ways I described, that in larger being probably like one end of the spectrum, where it's like a very tight plan and like really trying to kind of do it. But there's always this like sort of fugitive part, right? The thing that you can't control, and the unexpected and the unplanned, and those things have a role. And I think every outing, every type of artistic outing, and it has to do with, I think, how you then assign how that, like you described, like how that kind of pushes you forward to the next thing. Does that exist as something that creates a pace for the next thing? Like, okay, that becomes something that you attempt to sort of circumvent next time, or, oftentimes it can kind of set a momentum. But it's really hard to say, because I think if you have a very focused practice, and you sort of have like a medium that's consistent, there may be edges that you keep encountering over and over. But when you're all over the place, the goalposts literally change every time, right? So it's a very different thing. So I hope that answered your question. It's a little bit of my complex answer has to do with the complexity of your question, I guess.
No, it did. I appreciate it, because everything seems so effortless, and it's got this beauty to it, but you can tell really there is, and sometimes when you're making it, you stumble a lot. So it's,
oh my goodness, absolutely, absolutely. Making art is hard. Making art's really hard. I mean, I'm very suspicious when it comes easy to people. I know that sounds crazy, but I find it's very difficult, but it's a satisfaction, right? There's a satisfaction to kind of working through that difficulty, if that makes sense.
Great. Anyone else want to chime in with a question?
Thank you.
Okay, I think that means we're ready to wrap it up.
Okay.
Do
I
you have
didn't hear any in the chat. Sorry, maybe I should look there just in case.
Yeah, I think it's just thank yous now, and there's a lot of respect for your work here. Do you have any final comments or anything you want to make before we end for the evening?
No, I mean, I'm excited. I wish that I could be in a room with all of you in person. And I know that as a professor, going back to campus is exciting. And there's been so much, just, I don't know, just so much pleasure in kind of like sharing space with people. And I hope that you're all having a chance to do that aside from this interaction, which, you know, we're doing virtually. But yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, I just hope that you're finding time to do that as much as possible safely, and that you're able to be productive in these times, which are still tumultuous, you know, and continuing to be. So that's a very boilerplate, but just happy to be here and happy to, you know, it's a privilege to have a chance to, you know, share things with you all. So I really appreciate it.
Yes, and as the chat's blowing up, I think you have a lot of fans here. And we really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us tonight.
It's my pleasure, and please keep tabs. I'll try to come out there in person someday. I would love that, and yeah, I really appreciate your time and your great questions, you guys.
Okay, all right. Good night, everyone. And this is our last lecture for the semester. I'll be in touch about the next things that are going to happen for the class if you're in it. All right. Good night.
Awesome.
Bye, Amanda.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you. Have a great night.